Hello, my name is Bendy Dominicez. I'm an associate professor here at the Catholic University of Korea in the International Studies Department. I'm a associate professor of political science, and I'm presenting here my video poster for the conference on organization. And I think the best way to make the video presentation was to accompany the video poster, which I just prepared, and the title of the presentation is "The European Union's Common Agricultural Policy in Bulgaria: Critiquing the New York Times 2019 Expose of Common Agricultural Policy Corruption." So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the virtual poster, that on November 3rd, 2019, the New York Times on page 1 had a more than 4,000 word long investigative report on what it described as corruption in the allocation of common agricultural policy subsidies in the European Union among the East European member states, with a particular focus on Hungary, but also referencing Bulgaria and Slovakia and other states. But Hungary, because of the role of Viktor Orban as the prime minister of Hungary under the Fidesz party, and the European Union being particularly concerned about the illiberal political trends in Hungary and also in Poland, but particularly in Hungary, that there's a lot of focus in this expose from 14 months ago on the allocation of the common agricultural policy subsidies that the European Union gives to Hungary, and then the Hungarian government then distributes those common agricultural policy subsidies to the Hungarian or Bulgarian or Polish farming sector. The national governments of all the member states, the 27 member states, distribute the common agricultural policy subsidies to their farming sectors. And of course, the context in Eastern Europe is quite different because of the compared to France or Western European countries, because of the post-communist legacy in these former communist states that 30 years ago began their transition, if you consider the transition completed, from communism to what they hope will be stable, liberal, democratic, so-called developed states. And the tone of the article, which of the investigative report in the New York Times, is shocking. The shock about how the extent to which the common agricultural policy subsidies that the Hungarian and Bulgarian other governments, other authorities receive from the European Union are being used to serve the political interests of the ruling authorities in these countries. And to create new patron-client structures, patron-client relationships, which in this New York Times report, which is by Gebrikadan, Apuzzo, and Novak, populist politicians exploit EU aid, reaping millions. That these former communist state authorities are using these subsidies to reward their friends and exclude those who do not cooperate politically, to solidify their authority and their control in these societies, or their political influence in these societies. And the language that is used is quite strong in this New York Times article. And I should mention, by the way, that this New York Times investigative report, front page investigative report, was then followed up a couple days later in November of last year, of 2019, I should say, by an editorial in which New York Times editorial board again referenced this investigative report. But I didn't see any response, any kind of follow-up reporting in the New York Times, at least, that indicated the European Union was revising its common agricultural policy subsidy policy in the light of this supposed corruption that the New York Times has highlighted. And of course, a lot was going on at the time. There was another British election coming up, with Boris Johnson having taken control of the Conservative Party, and from Theresa May, and a campaign was underway in which Boris Johnson was campaigning on getting Brexit done, and that election in Britain happened in December. and then Boris Johnson's Conservative Party won in a landslide, and then confirming that Britain was indeed leaving the European Union, which it then did at the end of January. And then, of course, the world was hit by the pandemic. And so there, obviously, the European Union has been preoccupied with many issues besides the political turbulence caused by a New York Times reporting on common agricultural policies. But just to highlight some of the language here that this New York Times report used, the front page of the New York Times November edition report on East European authorities channeling European Union common agricultural policy funds for their political and material benefit. This investigative report noted that every year the 28 bloc pays out $65 billion in farm subsidies intended to support farmers around the continent and keep rural communities alive. But across Hungary, much of Central Eastern Europe, the bulk goes to a connected and powerful few. The Prime Minister of the Czech Republic collected tens of millions of dollars in subsidies just last year. Subsidies have underwritten mafia-style land grabs in Slovakia and Bulgaria. And I argue in the paper from which this presentation comes that this investigative report illustrates some of the foundational laissez-faire elements of American prevailing assumption of views regarding the appropriate relationship of the state to the economy. I highlight Bulgaria in the presentation because I spent a lot of time in Bulgaria. I worked in Bulgaria at the American University in Bulgaria from 1994 to 2009, and I'm continuing to follow Bulgaria and write about Bulgaria and write on Bulgaria. And so that's the focus of the Bulgarian angle in this presentation. And so the paper of investigative report, of the New York Times investigative report, I argue is critiquing what is going on in Eastern Europe in this case from American prevailing political views about appropriate, inappropriate political and economic behavior from an American perspective, from American perspectives about what is considered to be the appropriate political economy that's connected with what we call today neoliberalism, and that that report and that those assumptions underlying this report that leads to use of language like mafia-style land grabs. And a new feudalism are very judgmental terms, obviously, but I think obviously oversimplifies the political complexities of what's going on in Eastern Europe, particularly from the point of view of the European Union's focus on on maintaining relative political stability in these societies, which are undergoing truly revolutionary transformations over the last 30 years, more than 30 years. But the level of revolutionary change is hard to underestimate in these societies, particularly in a country like Bulgaria, which collectively speaking, I would argue in the Eastern European context, was more socialized as a community into accepting Soviet imposed norms in political and economics and society and social relations as being acceptable than in countries, for example, like Poland. So, but even in Poland, the level of revolutionary change these countries are undergoing is hard to overestimate, far surpassing, for example, the kinds of revolutionary change that happened as a result of the collapse of fascism, say in Germany and Italy and in Japan during World War II. At least under those fascist regimes, they still had forms of capitalism. They still had institutions of capital accumulation and notions of private sector, private property as an institutional foundation for the economy. And in Eastern Europe, this didn't exist, right? I mean, when I was doing my field research in graduate school back in the 1980s in Poland, not Bulgaria, but in Poland, Polish bankers under the communist system, I was told by my friends, these Polish bankers were asking my friends, how do you set up a checking account? What is this thing called a checking account? I mean, they don't even know what a checking account was. Just to illustrate the revolutionary nature of the changes underway. And the European Union as a peace strategy is confronting this, the nationalism in these countries as a perennial threat to stability of these young democratic political systems in these societies, and nationalism is the main challenge to peace in Europe. And the European Union has a peace strategy for which it received a Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, must confront the challenge of nationalism. And nationalism is, as I conceptualize it, is addressed in the presentation from political psychological perspective, a theory of nationalism based upon social and political psychology. And nationalism associates with polarization, stereotyping of self and other, seeing adversaries in grossly oversimplified terms that associate with intense emotion, affect. Nationalism emerges in the midst of rapid change within the society, particularly within nation states like Poland, like Hungary, like Bulgaria, like the United States, as we have seen with the Trump phenomenon, and in Brazil. And in Russia, nationalism intensifies as a political behavior, motivation, and perceptual and attitudinal dynamic, collective perceptual attitudinal dynamic within these societies that associates with intense polarization and intense emotion, including hatred, disgust, and of course, in most intense cases, leads to war. So, and civil war, external war, the case of Germany, for example, and even in Germany, genocidal attacks against minorities inside Germany. So that's the challenge, and nationalism in these societies and former Eastern European societies, of course, is greatly intensified as a potential motivation after over 40 years of communist imperial, Soviet communist imperialism, and the 40 years of domination and co-optation of a willing sector of society that was willing to collaborate with those foreign imposed regimes that the Soviet Union, that Moscow imposed, and involving a significant percentage of the population joining the communist parties in Poland and Bulgaria and Hungary. And we know, of course, that if you're going to join the Communist Party because somebody might be an ambitious, smart person, and they want to pursue career opportunities, and if you want the most career opportunities, you have to join the party. And to join the party, you have to demonstrate your loyalty. And demonstrating your loyalty involves behavior that is looked down upon, obviously, today, including being an informer on your friends, on your family, reporting to the Communist Party and the Communist Party police about what your friends and family are saying that might be a challenge or a threat to the established communist order. And so if one was willing to be co-opted and to make those kinds of so-called traitors or treasonous or traitorous behaviors, you could become a member of the party elite and get the benefits, including making relationships with others in other countries, going abroad to study after you've demonstrated political loyalty, polishing your English as the language of international business. And then communism collapses in the late 1980s, and who emerges, of course, as the best business people, the best practitioners of business relationships, the former nomenclatura, the former communist elite, or their offspring. Their children and grandchildren become the beneficiaries of post-communism. They are the ones that have the most social networks, most sophisticated social networks, who come from elite families that have a culture of being comfortable with being influential and wielding influence and authority within their local or broader contexts. Getting the education opportunities, learning English. And so this is a point highlighted in all of this presentation here, that there's a great potential for resentment, obviously, among those sections of societies that view themselves as having lost out on most of the benefits of Europeanization, of joining the European Union, but who's benefiting the most? The nomenclatura and their offspring, their children and grandchildren. And so the European Union has to co-opt these alternative emerging authority centers within these post-communist societies into viewing the European Union as a source of beneficial material and career and political resources for them as well. And so, and of course, that's what the common agricultural policy subsidies are partly being used for, to build alternative elite networks, social networks that support alternative other factions within these post-communist states, like Hungary, like Poland, like Bulgaria, and this is happening within a revolutionary change context in which there is no or very little societal consensus on what is right or wrong, what is appropriate behavior, inappropriate behavior. I mean, I remember when I first came to Bulgaria in 1994, the point was made to me, you know, that the laws that were still on the books in Bulgaria at the time were inherited from the communist system, laws that were set up to oppose capitalism. So anybody who's a successful business person in Bulgaria is automatically a criminal in the early 1990s in Bulgaria, because they're disobeying the laws, which hadn't been changed yet. Right. So, you know, the question that emerged at the time when I was there was, how do we, what is an entrepreneur versus a mafioso in Bulgaria in, say, 1994? And the point was made, we might decide that an entrepreneur is somebody who's successful. A mafioso is somebody who uses physical violence to promote their interests, deadly force. And so when you read statements like mafia-style land grabs, describing what's going on in these societies, which, remember, in the early 1990s, these societies were overwhelmingly, I mean, where a much bigger population, section of the population were still rural. I mean, when I got to Bulgaria, I was told that over 30% of the population in Bulgaria in the early 1990s were still peasants and farmers. What I read in the New York Times a week or two ago, that the percent of the population in the United States that are farming in the United States is 0.6%. So these societies are undergoing tremendous change, turbulent change, and the common agricultural policy helps bring order and political cooptation and structure that change and control of that change. So, and this is true throughout Eastern Europe, that almost a third of the population were still farmers or peasants at the time of the fall of communism. So I read a year or so ago that in Poland, that percentage of the population is now down to 15%. So over 30 years, the percent of the population in Poland that is still in the farming sector has been reduced by 1/2. It's still 15%, when, as I said, it's 0.6% in the United States. So that means lots of small landowners are losing or selling their farms. And there's much amalgamation of agricultural land into bigger farms, and that's expected. And that's going to be in these societies that are part of the global economy. And you can imagine it's been a great success of the European Union that the rural section of the population typically has not generated even more discontent in these societies, given the magnitude of the changes and the turbulence these societies are undergoing. And that's just the success of the European Union. It doesn't get enough credit, I'll conclude here, it doesn't get enough credit for its successes. It only gets criticized for its failure to prevent violence in Yugoslavia or violence in Ukraine, for example. But if it prevents nationalist polarization from intensifying to the point of fear, paranoia, and violence, it's a non-event. It doesn't get in the front page of the newspaper when there's not a civil war in Romania between the Hungarians and the Romanians over Transylvania, for example, or there's not fighting in Estonia and Latvia between the Russian minority and the large Russian minority and the Estonian and Latvian populations in those societies. And so, but of course, the European Union should get part of the credit for that peace. So that's the orientation towards this presentation, and I will hopefully, that makes the video poster a little more comprehensible. So I think I'll stop there and stop the presentation because I think I've gone over 20 minutes. So that's all. Thank you.